Om Shanti, everyone joining us from South Africa and other parts of the world. Very warm welcome to the second part of Denise Ben's talk entitled From Soul Consciousness to God Consciousness. And the reason for this follow-up talk is that there was a great many souls who were interested in what Denise Ben had to share on the last two. So that is why there was a request for today's follow-up course and talk. So Denise Ben will spend half an hour or so sharing her thoughts on the understanding of soul consciousness and how it relates to our relationship with Baba. Denise Ben, I think what garnered a lot of interest from your last talk is when you mentioned pain. You spoke extensively about pain. How pain affects the psyche, how it affects soul consciousness, how we manage it, etc. And also how it affects our relationship with Baba. And I think that's what got people so hooked into what you had to say. And so myself and many others are looking forward to what it is that you have to share today.
Thank you, Magla. Thank you so much. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to be with all of you again one more time. I'm doing all my technology here, so every so often I have to do a little something. Yeah, I think all of you must have listened to the Murli today. Better. And in the Murli, there was something that I found particularly pertinent to what we are talking about together here. So in the Murli today, I was particularly noticing this one thing about sanskaras. Some of you might have been on the Murli when I was reading it from the San Francisco site, I don't know. So this particular point that was there is that when you are in your consciousness, that you are speaking about spiritual knowledge, you are aware that you're meditating, that you're a meditator, you shift yourself into that consciousness. And then every so often you forget about that and you go into what was defined in the Murli today as your original sanskaras. The thing is this, that everybody, like a drug addict, has one drug that they absolutely cannot give up. And in the same way, every BK has a sanskar or a personality trait or a thing that you do which takes you down and which keeps you down. Sometimes it may be you're diminishing yourself. Sometimes it may be that you are full of criticism. Sometimes your thing may be that you get upset, or your thing may be that you become arrogant or you become angry. So everybody has one of these things, which in the Murli was classified as an original sanskar. But in my terminology, I would call it your key, essential, fundamental Achilles heel problem. And I think it's quite possible, in fact, I may almost say I'm fairly sure that this is connected with your original trauma of this life. Because the point about spiritual practice and doing all these things that we're doing here in Brahma Kumari's meditation, study, dharna, service, all the things that we do, is all in order to heal from that one original trauma. And I think that we can also say that the drama is constructed in such a way that whatever is our fundamental weakness is going to be triggered by some trauma that happens to us in early life, in childhood. The importance of this is that if it doesn't get triggered in childhood, it's not going to present itself to you in adulthood as your Achilles heel. So your Achilles heel is this this real deep weakness, character defect, your key attribute of body consciousness that is the real big one. And when it happens to you in childhood as a trauma, as a child, you have absolutely no defense whatsoever. You are completely open, completely innocent. You are the center of your universe. And even if something is not happening to you directly, but you're observing some traumatic event happening between other people, you experience it as if it is happening directly to you. And in that way, it becomes a trauma. So everybody has something like this. In order to do the spiritual work, we need to identify this. And to identify this involves this thing which Baba speaks of as keeping your chart. And keeping your chart means really looking closely at yourself and noticing what happens when you are pulled away from what you think is your real personality. And I think a person's, what they call their own real personality, is the persona that they project. And what Baba has told us is that, okay, you become soul conscious, you practice to be soul conscious, you practice to be in your power, and you practice to express yourself as you feel that you are when you're in your power. And there will be other people around you who will be able to detect where your weaknesses are. Very often these are your people who you live with at home, because they are particularly aware about what your weaknesses are. And so they will immediately press your button, and by pressing your button, you immediately are flipped off from that performance, and you are pushed into your weak stage. And then they might even ridicule you for it. But now Baba has given us a rather interesting take on it. And this this button pressing activity of other people who can detect your weakness is really helpful, because they think they are triggering your reality, but they're not. They're actually touching your wound, but they think they're triggering your reality, and they reflect back to you that they're triggering your reality. But all of that is an illusion. Your illusion, their illusion, everybody's illusion. But Baba is quite clear about this, and he explains it to us so that we can be quite clear about it too. So he sometimes talks to us about our titles of self-respect. And these titles of self-respect are sometimes mentioned in different murlis. There's one particular murli where there's a whole string of them. And he tells us, would you practice these titles of self-respect, because they correspond to who you actually are. And that your weakness, though it may overwhelm you and overpower you and take over your existence and make itself known to people who know you well, that is not your reality. That is your wound. And this is where your pain lies. And he is the great healer. So he's also teaching us about how to become free from our wound in a number of different ways. And I think this particular aspect of the wound, as far as I know, has not been flagged up by psychological research, because I just saw it really clearly for the first time when I was reading out the Murli today, that this is a very, very important piece of information that we need to know, that we need to be able to work with, because it's a strategy, it's a tactic to enable us to remain who we really are, that even though we all have a wound, but our wound is not available for other people to play around with, or for circumstances to pull us back into. How do we do this is quite important. We do it by really understanding what the wound is. And this is why the chart is helpful. And Baba has talked about, which I think is very revealing, write your life story. And your life story contains your wound. And if you go back to the earliest part of your life, and usually when people are thinking about writing their life story, they are talking about the sins that they've committed. And this is how it's always presented, that write down all your sins. But what they don't say is that your greatest sins, in the new definition of sin, is how and when and under what circumstances you have taken pain, or you have taken sorrow, or you have been badly treated by people, especially those who are supposed to be your protectors and caregivers, because you're completely open to them. And so I will just reiterate what I quite often mention in terms of sin. 3 kinds of sin. The first 2 kinds of sin everybody knows about. Sins of commission, do not do what you are not supposed to do. You already know that. And sins of omission, do what you are supposed to do. Do not fail to fulfill your obligations, duties. So those 2 sins everybody knows because they're in all the religions. But the third sin is not in any of the religions, but it's the biggest one. And that is that you receive pain, you receive sorrow, you receive negative energy from circumstances, from people, from places, which in the Murlis is described as taking sorrow. This is where your wound is. This is where your wound keeps getting touched. This is your button, that very sensitive, bruised part of your soul, which people detect, and then they touch and they set you off. And they gleefully do this because they think that they have won some points. But now we need to really understand that all they have done is opened up your wound and added to your pain. And so how do we handle this in terms of spiritual practice? So as I mentioned, the first thing is to find out what it is. So when you're doing your story, when you're writing your life story, write down your resentments, write down the very seriously traumatic and bad things that happened to you, and how you felt about it, and what it did to you, and how it still triggers when you're in similar situations or with people who are behaving in that kind of a way. And most of it will have to do with belittling you or sexually molesting you or assaulting you, or telling you that you're not wanted, that you're not good enough, all this type of thing, which is absolutely normal in today's world, in today's culture, all these lovely ways of mistreating people that the adults seem to enjoy doing so much, or they're completely unaware of what they're doing. And so it's a very lucky child who is raised in a family where everything is really healthy and pure and good. And even if you are raised in a family like that, as soon as you look outside the family, then it's not like that. And so you can have traumatic experiences from the world outside the family. But a lot of the time, it's inside the family. So you see your wound in different situations. What I want us to do is go into the depth of this, because I think that, one of the things I do from San Francisco on Thursday evenings, my evening, your morning, Friday morning, is a session on the convergence of spiritual and psychological work. And I think it's really very relevant because many people in the spiritual practice, they encounter a block where it comes to, just dealing with the sanskaras, as Baba has mentioned in the Murli today. And people think about it like, oh, this is bad and I have to battle with it because it's my badness. No, nothing to do with that. All that is from the angle of religion, the angle of moralizing, and it is absolutely ineffective, or even worse, it's counterproductive. So I would strongly recommend that you quit doing that. Doesn't work, never has, never will. It's really all about healing the wound. And the wound also, once you've identified it and once you have understood that that is not your real self, that is just your wound, but that your real self pre-exists your wound. Your wound came later. Even if it was in another lifetime, it'll still come up in every lifetime because it has to be resolved. And your original sanskara, your real original sanskara, is you're a pure, peaceful, powerful, loveful, blissful being of light, which I often mention. And then you look deeply into yourself. What is your speciality, your special vibration, your beauty, the real you. And occasionally in meditation, you can go so deep that you get past all of these surface matters and you arrive at the bottom of the ocean of your being, your experience. Yeah, this is what it's like to be me. And it corresponds to these titles of self-respect. It corresponds to the definition of a soul. But because consciousness is under the influence of the wound, it is not so easy to go there. Now, you go there from time to time and you can't easily hold it for very long. So the tactic that Baba had mentioned in the Murli today is a very interesting one, very deep one. And that is that you adopt the persona of a person who is sharing the knowledge of God to other people. And as soon as you do that, you get into that mentality. It's just something that happens automatically and is designed that way. And why Baba says you have to do service, not because people start understanding what you're saying, not because they might or might not start becoming Brahmins. No, none of that. Service is really something that you engage in with another person or other people in order to adopt the consciousness of a soul-conscious soul who is aware of what your highest stage is, and you come into that as you communicate. This is why we do service. And even Baba had made it very clear that if you're doing service and there are disturbances around it, or you cause disturbances to others, when we do big programs, there's always lots of people getting disturbed, then it means that that actually wasn't service. And I think everybody thinks that service means I am serviceable and I'm serving other people and it's all for them, but actually it's all for you. And it's a trick of the drama or an instruction from Baba that says, do service, any kind of service, because when you think that you're doing service, it gets you to come into that soul conscious consciousness. It gets you to be in your power, and you're there for the duration of when you're doing service. And then when you're not doing service, you go, as it were, back to normal. And so when you're back to normal, it's very easy for people to press your buttons, or for you to have internal button pressing through what's known as waste thoughts. And in the last couple of days, we've been discussing this word waste, viert, and one person came up with the meaning of the word, which is from the dictionaries as futile. And I thought that was a very, very good expression, because indeed the thoughts that arise from these wounds or these sanskaras of body consciousness or whatever, those thoughts can bring you down. It can bring you into self-doubt. It can bring you into a feeling of, lack of self-confidence, or you feel depressed, or any of these things can arise. And when they do arise, at that moment, you are away from being in your power, and your, what Baba called today, original samskara, but which is your kind of weakness of choice, your original wound that comes up and it takes over your consciousness. So consider body consciousness to be something like wound consciousness. You're operating from your wound. You're not operating from your original spiritual reality, the real you, who is the pure, beautiful soul that you were when you first came down on this earth, but which was destroyed when you received your wound, and which is there, and this is the pain that you carry. And it will express itself in the form of weak action, which is either you do harm to other people or you do harm to yourself, a kind of homicidal, suicidal way of being. And this is what Baba is helping us to be free from. And the big problem, I think, that we are limited by is that people think of it as being bad. And it's nothing to do with being bad. It's all to do with being wounded. So I hope that everyone will give up once and for all the idea that anyone is bad, although their behavior may be unpleasant and irritating. It's because they're wounded, and you don't have to buy into this whole moralistic interpretation of human behavior, because it is actually quite off track. And of course, it's a real thing, and Magla's going to tell me I see these bad people every day and I have to deal with them. And that is absolutely right, because the wound has taken hold to such an extent that the person decides this is what I am, and their behavior is impossible to control, and so it works like that. So I am going to stop there. I've brought up a point that I think quite a few people may not have understood, because it's definitely quite new for me.
So deep, sharing, so powerful of being able to remove the wounds from within the self. And I know Magla has been having questions.
Yes, there is one message on the chat, which is, what time is the event on Thursday evening, from Andre Young. And the event on Thursday evening, which is a San Francisco event, is San Francisco time 6 p.m. And you have to figure out what time that is in South Africa. I think it's 9 hours later, so that might be your Amrit Vela.
Hello, Denise Ben. Denise Ben, the first question I have for you is, in light of what you said today, a lot of people have problems managing their feelings. So they may have done the work that you just mentioned, but they're still left with their feelings, which is the feelings of the trauma of the past, in whichever way it presents itself. How do you go about managing your dark side, managing your feelings, and still practice all consciousness and have yoga? How do you do that?
That is really how the wound plays out. It will raise feelings like waves of anxiety, waves of fear, waves of self-doubt, waves of anger, all these things which are classified as vices and feelings and negative emotions and so on. They come up, and the reason why Baba has given us the powers is so that we can manage these waves that come up. Because the mechanism of yoga is that when you have yoga, it will loosen your wound, and it will cause the poison of the wound to emerge in terms of feelings which erupt. And what you need is to allow those to come up and to pass out. So it's a kind of a purging sort of situation. And what people usually do is they try and suppress it, which means it has to come back more powerfully, because if it can't get out easily, it'll find a way to come out with volcanic power, and then you will find it really difficult to manage. So all these feelings that come up, they need to be understood as, this is some poison from my wound, which needs to come out. And so you have to kind of open yourself up. The power of accommodation is maybe you can compare it to a woman who's giving birth. She has to really expand her pelvis to allow the baby to come out, and there's usually a lot of pain involved. And when people are having contractions and all of this, extremely painful. So there's various different practices that people do to prepare for this. And I think that for us, on the one hand, the yoga will cause it to erupt. And on the other hand, the yoga will enable us to develop the powers which will allow us to open up and stop kind of trying to hold down the pain or prevent the pain or tense up against the pain. No, we have to relax, and we have to allow the pain to take its course. So this power of accommodation and the power of tolerance are really helpful. And when they're called powers, it means you are able to allow that pain to erupt and come out. When the pain is too much, which it usually is, you have a reaction to the pain, which is to get angry or upset or depressed or whatever. But these behaviors are reactions to the pain that wants to come up. And so when you are having this, first thing is never to tell yourself that it is bad. Because by telling yourself it is bad, you try and suppress it, which means it has to get worse in order to come out. Because this process of Raj Yoga is a purification process. How many times Baba says, I'm the purifier? And people come to Raj Yoga as if it is religion, but in so many ways it's totally the opposite of religion. So you come to Raj Yoga assuming that it's like all the other religions, which are telling you how bad you are and that you have to get lots of punishment from sin, and there's all sorts of expressions of that nature in the Murlis and so on. But you need to come to it from a very different angle. So punishment means pain. And it's not that somebody's enforcing this pain on you, it's just happening because there's a wound. And the wound comes partly because you did negative karma, but mostly because negative karma was done to you and you're reacting to that by doing additional negative karma. But I think that we need to tell ourselves that the biggest problem is I took sorrow. It was not my fault. It was absolutely normal. There's nothing bad about it. It's just the nature of the beast. When you come into the Copper Age and the Iron Age, sorrow happens. And now that you're in the Confluence Age, all of these feelings are there, and they have a right to be there, absolute right to be there. But it's about managing them. And managing feelings starts with not telling yourself you're bad, giving space for them to come out because you don't want to keep them inside, they're damaging you. And then give that space, which is created by this negativity coming out, allow that space to be touched by Baba's virtues and qualities. And then you will find yourself much more easily able to handle it. And if it takes forever to do it, it's okay. It's really quite all right.
Ben, the one question that has been sent to me from a BK in South Africa is that apart from the pain, one is left with doubts and insecurities. So the one thing that affects one is the wound itself and the pain that comes from the wound, whether it presents as depression or sorrow or anger or aggression. And the other is the consequences of the pain, like self-doubt, insecurity, questioning whether you're a real Brahmin or not, and even insecurity in other aspects of your life. What I'm saying is that pain has the ability to overwhelm people, whether you're a Brahmin or not. And so what techniques do you have, what self-talk does one engage in to not let the pain overwhelm you and not end up being a person who doubts oneself or is insecure?
I think this is what was specially addressed in today's Murli, that when you forget your original pure spiritual identity and you move away from your seat of self-respect, those other things, they're your default inner voice, and they come rushing in. And so the self-talk to tell oneself is, you have to say, I am. It's about asserting yourself. I am a real Brahmin. And if anybody doesn't agree with it, who cares? It's none of their business. My spiritual practice is between me and God. And anybody making comments, it's their problem. It's not my problem. You have to assert this. And it's difficult to do that because we have created a culture. I don't know why we did that, but we did. We created a culture where we criticize each other and find each other's faults and all that. And I think the main reason actually why we do this is because whatever they do in normal Iron-aged world, thinking it's cool and good and whatnot, but which it isn't, which is arrogance, they just import it into the BK world and contaminate the BK world by doing that. And Shiv Baba patiently has to get us to not do that, which takes him 80 years, several births or whatever of us. But we have to really look at the culture we have created and start asserting that you're not going to be intimidated by it. You're not going to be put down by it. You're not going to act like a pawn in somebody else's game. Really, you have to be assertive. That's very, very important. Because otherwise, everybody will say, oh, you're full of ego. So then you switch to the inferiority in the name of humility. And then all of those self-doubt and insecurity comes rushing in like a tsunami saying, ooh, I got this one, and that's why we call it Maya. But, you have to understand that when you create a culture where people can behave with each other the way they do in the Iron Age and call it spirituality, you have to call it out. You have to challenge it, because if you don't, then you're delaying Baba's work by a great deal. And so I think that we need to do that. It's quite necessary and appropriate and suitable. And we're not going to end up very soon in the golden age if we don't do that. So we really need to do this, I think, collectively and start talking about these things and not go on and on and on about how bad everyone is, because they're not. But it's quite a big job to change a culture, including the Brahmin culture, because it's just a copy-paste of the Iron Age culture, and that's not what we are supposed to be doing. What do you think?
Yeah, wow, that was a cliffhanger of a question. Yes, so Denise Ben, there are many who get what you are saying theoretically, okay? But it's one thing to understand that one should manage one's pain, to actually doing it in reality. Because pain comes to some by way of a volcanic eruption. It comes in the way of a bad mood. It comes in the way of something happening to you or someone happening to you. So what is your self-talk when pain erupts?
What I found very interesting in the Murli today is that Baba said, whether you've been doing this for 50 years in the Golden Jubilee, or one day you're still doing the same thing, which means that the self-talk that people use is the wrong one. It's not effective. So the self-talk is, okay, this pain is coming out, this pain is erupting. First of all, you have to acknowledge, I am in pain. I feel self-doubt. I feel disconnected from Baba. I feel all of these things. Acknowledge it, because what's so great about, pretending to be not? That doesn't work. Everybody does it, but it's a waste of time and ridiculous. So we must stop doing that. An eruption is coming, so an eruption is coming. It needs to come. And I think many people who are on this session with us together have been working on various old sanskaras for donkey's years. And so I would imagine everybody's pretty tired of it and would like to have a different way of doing it, because it's kind of the same old, same old, same old. And you say, either I get a different way of doing this or I quit, because it's not working. I mean, I'm sure there are people who would feel like that even if they don't quit. They're saying, it's not working. I'm not managing this samskara. And the thing is, we have to give it space to be there, number one. We have to, which is not really self-talk, but it is to do with bringing oneself into a more subtle state of consciousness. And when you're in a more subtle state of consciousness, it's much easier to connect with Baba. It's much easier to drop that stuff. So when you're fighting against it, you're not in a subtle state of consciousness. You're trying to put out the fire with petrol, and it just makes it worse. So what I do whenever anything like that comes to me, I just make myself more subtle. And then also really pay attention to the study, because everything is in there, but it's so hidden that people don't see it. And that's because we project all this religious attitude onto it, so that you don't actually hear what Baba's saying. You hear what you think he's probably saying, which is actually not what he's actually saying. And that includes people who are very experienced BKs who fail to see these very subtle things that Baba is saying. But it doesn't matter, do it anyway. Make yourself subtle. Acknowledge what is happening. If you have a voice inside that says, I'm a bad BK, bring another voice which says, no, you're not. There's no such thing. You are working on becoming free. And so this deep poison that got into the soul has a right to come out. You have a right to let it out. And it comes out in many, many different varieties of negative feelings and emotions. And tell yourself this will pass by letting it out. It's okay. Karma is getting finished. Nothing bad, The self-punishing voices need to be quietened. I'm okay. I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone. I'm just trying to be real and me, and I'm healing, and like that. I think that is a way.
Brother Andre Young asks, what techniques can we use to choose the appropriate power based on the frequency? And he refers to a map of consciousness by David Hawkins that we are at. how do we strengthen spiritual intelligence, where the basis of this intelligence or consciousness is the correction to this God consciousness?
Thank you, Andre. I am not familiar with David Hawkins' map of consciousness, so I can't really speak to that. And his map of consciousness may be a little bit different from my map of consciousness, so we may end up different destinations. I'm not sure, but what I can say is that the way Baba teaches us is he says, okay, you've got these 8 powers and they have names, and then you've got other powers which are not in the list of names, the list of the 8. And you see, what he's asking us to do is to figure out stuff for ourselves. And the basic ingredients for that he gives is the Murli. And you have the English translation of the Murli, which is quite biased towards moralizing, which is not really there in the Hindi Murli. So that's just something you have to factor out. And I think you can do that because BKs are never limited by physical constraints unless they allow themselves to be. So if it doesn't feel quite right, then listen to your feeling and just work with that. Because we have been given so much time to develop our spiritual practice of Raj Yoga, it means we have time to experiment. And he says quite often that we need to experiment. So we have to experiment with the different powers and virtues and qualities. And if you find David Hawkins' map of consciousness useful, then that's great. But you really have to find your own way. You're in a unknown territory of the quest to find yourself and find your way home. And most of the people who are writing books and so on are using the knowledge that's there in the path of bhakti, directly or indirectly. And what Baba is telling us is really pretty different. So generally speaking, we find that some of those things will be useful to a slight extent, but they never are great enough to displace some of the things, or the things that Baba is saying, because they're so deep. But it's a matter for us of arriving at that depth, because he gives us the ocean and then we have to create some kind of submarine or depth, like a bell that goes down, and we have to go down. And the only way we can go down is by churning, by looking at our experiences dispassionately. He speaks to us about being a detached observer, really going over things that happen to us, looking at what triggers our feelings, and look at the different titles of self-respect and try them. And generally speaking, there's so much that you can't try all of it. It's just too much. But things from that day's Murli are very often exactly what you need, because oddly enough, whenever you're really trying to figure something out, or you're really seriously thinking about something, he will talk about it and you will hear it. The other people will hear something else, because this is God's way to communicate with us. And every BK hears the Murli differently, even though it's all got the same stuff in it. Every BK meditates differently. Every BK pursues the pilgrimage of remembrance differently. So he encourages us to experiment, and then we share our experiences. So I hope that that is useful for you.
you spoke about not fighting and kind of honoring yourself and taking up the challenge of your own pain in a dignified way. What I'm wondering is how do you know that you are not being a warrior and facing your pain like a golden age soul or with golden age sanskaras instead of laboring, what Baba calls laboring? And in the same question, the same vein, I note that it's the sanskar of disheartenment is one that plagues many Brahmins from time to time because they may be progressing as a BK, but because the same wound comes up again and again in such an overwhelming fashion that they feel disheartened. And disheartenment is quite a killer as far as one's spiritual progress is concerned. It can also cause a Brahmin to give up on him or herself. So how do you manage both of these?
I think at the most fundamental way, I think that we have to teach this differently. Because I think that the way we teach Gyan causes a lot of disheartenment and prevents a lot of progress, because it's taught in the manner of the sort of old-fashioned 19th century, maybe Victorian way of shoot first and ask questions later, and that kind of thing. Or it's all about that if you can put somebody down enough, they will somehow improve, which is a completely weird approach, but it's so deeply embedded in the culture that it found its way into Gyan, and we have to do it really, really differently. And the only way to change a culture is to change it here and there. And so start with the self. You know, if you feel disheartened, it's because you have been trained to set the bar so high that you can never make it. And this is known in psychology as a setup. And there's plenty of setups in the way that BKs learn to teach spiritual knowledge. And so I think one of the things we have to do is call it out and say, no. You know, like you hear the word constant, because Baba uses the word sada and is translated as constant. And people who are in this culture, Western culture, say, they will say constant means every second. And if I'm not doing it every second, then I'm a failure, you see. And this is a cultural thing. And so we need to just step back a little bit and be a lot more realistic about what we're doing. And I think it's also very important to challenge this word easy for easy Raj Yoga. It's the wrong translation. Sahaj means in the context of other people. Doesn't mean easy. And it's in comparison with the sannyasis who do it without the context of other people, because they think as long as you're in the context of other people, it's impossible. And Baba says, it's very difficult, but it's better to do it in the context of other people, because that's your context. It's also important to understand that Raj Yoga is studied and practiced in the context of adversity. You are doing it in the context of being at your weakest, with maximum amount of karma. And so instead of being, aggressive about how it's taught, one has to be compassionate. And there's not that much compassion in the way that these things are taught. And it's because of this that you get all the disheartenment. Because if it were taught bearing in mind all these things and using a language that bears in mind these things, you wouldn't get triggered into disheartenment. So to me, the pedagogy is a big aspect of it. And when a person feels disheartened about themselves, which they have a right to do, and they may feel disheartened, then what is needed is encouragement. And, you know, why we are doing this in the context of each other is that there are some who've been doing it longer, so they have a little bit more experience, so they can give you encouragement. They don't have to pretend that they are doing so well because they've got a higher position and you are just a newbie, and so you've got a long way to go and you probably won't make it anyway. That's not a very good culture to follow. So we are just brothers and sisters in a family, and everybody has all kinds of karmic accounts, and everybody is quite weak, and we are slowly, incrementally gathering together some strengths. And Baba is gently teaching us, little by little, to take power from him, and to know that we need to take power from him, but at the same time, when we do take power from him, it'll cause the two sides of ego to happen. One side is the inferiority, which is where your disheartenment comes from, and the other side is the superiority, which is where the arrogance comes from. So what you've got is a big game of the superiority and the inferiority going on endlessly, and it's taking up all our time and energy. And what he's saying is, you know, you really don't need to play that game. You've been doing it for thousands of years, and this is really a different game. And the different game is that you are selected, you are good, you have some karmic accounts, you want to be perfect, and you understand perfect as far as perfectionism is concerned, so you will always be imperfect in comparison with your idea of perfection. That's a given when you do it like that. No. Perfect means you've got light and you're balanced. That's perfect. But people always write long list of what's perfect, you know, and they're especially designed to make it impossible to arrive there. And we sabotage ourselves collectively and individually. And my feeling is that we're good and tired of doing it like that. And we need to approach this in a much more realistic, practical way, in such a way that everyone who does it, who follows this path, does it in such a way and in such a context that you have the maximum best chance of moving forward rapidly. But at the moment, you have the maximum best chance of giving up, because it's a competition. And when you have unhealthy competition, then the other people like to put you down instead of making themselves go forward. So we need to change this and remind ourselves, which Baba keeps doing, you know, you are, you know, going to succeed. And be patient, take it easy. It's unlikely that you can have really, really good meditation for more than 4 or 5 seconds per day. Forget about 8 hours, you know. But anytime you pay attention to yourself as a person who's developing spiritually, that's included in your 8 hours of yoga. But yeah, I really think that we must start doing our practice more effectively in a new way, not in a religious way, in a spiritual way.
Denise, how then does one know whether you are progressing? If the pain keeps coming up again and again, year in and year out, after you've been in Gyan for 20 years, and the same issues come up again and again. You see, we all have our own ways of assessing whether we've progressed. Okay, but within spirituality, it's very difficult to make that call. So how do you know that you have gained some power, that you have moved forward when the same issues come up in your mind, in your relationships, again and again?
I think I'm going to go back again and again to my point. You set the bar in an impossibly high position, and then it's a setup for failure. But every time something comes up and you say to yourself things like, I failed, I'm bad, da 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 da, you kind of don't really get any further. And so I think that the way we do it needs to be different. And so I would suggest write your story and write what your pain is. Because your pain may well not have been identified. You also need to have a very good and friendly relationship with your pain. Because one problem that I think people haven't understood is to think of your pain as an enemy. You know, like President Trump is having a war against coronavirus, and coronavirus is winning because he thinks of it as an enemy, and an invisible one at that. No, you need to understand that pain is not an enemy. Pain is a messenger. It is a great teacher. And whenever your pain comes up, look deep and listen deeply for the message. What is it telling you? Because it's telling you something important. There's no need for pain for any other reason than to tell you what you need to know. And so first thing is to create a friendly relationship with pain. That, okay, I'm here, I'm wounded, and my wound is hurting me because my wound wants to tell me something, and pain is just like ringing on the doorbell saying, would you please let me in because I need to tell you something. And the pain gets worse and worse and worse by you trying to get rid of it. And so once you say, okay, pain, I welcome you, I want to feel you, I want to understand you, I want to understand what your message is, because the only way out is through. You know that expression. And so just the idea of thinking that Raj Yoga means you should not have any pain, where did that idea come from? You know, it's from religion or something like that. No, pain, I've often said, pain is mandatory. Suffering is optional. So as you welcome your pain, you bring your pain close to yourself, you talk to your pain, you talk to your wound, you want to know what this is all about, because it's there to help you to become whole, to heal. And your powers are there to help you manage the pain and not break down around the pain and not suffer. Suffering means you are using the pain to give you a reason to feel bad about yourself. And managing the pain is using the pain to understand about yourself more deeply and arrive at contact with yourself. So our relationship with pain needs to change, and the environment that we're in, the social environment that we're in, has a message that pain is bad. Take an aspirin. If that doesn't work, take something else, all the way up to morphine. And if that doesn't work, then die. That's our culture's relationship with pain. This is why there's such a mess, because people haven't understood the role of pain in life.
Making friends with your pain. Denise, I haven't recovered from that one, but yeah, okay, let's just move on. So Denise, when you speak about managing pain, you do so with such a sense of dignity, which is actually quite lovely. How do you maintain your dignity and equanimity in dealing with pain? Because people's natural reaction, whether you're a Brahmin or not, is to feel overwhelmed by pain. Okay, and it's a question that I asked earlier as well. Baba speaks of not laboring, and he speaks of conquering, which is the golden aged version of dealing with pain, or the silver aged way of dealing with pain. How do you maintain your dignity throughout all of this?
I wouldn't use this word golden age version and silver aged version. That's a BK way to sabotage yourself. I wouldn't go there. I would just simply say that pain is part of life. It's necessary in life. It's a good piece of life. You cannot have life without death. He says this drama is a game of happiness and sorrow, victory and defeat, and all these pairs of opposites. And it's all in the Gita, quoted word by word. There are many quotes from the Gita in the Murli. And what the Gita says, and what Baba also says, is when things go really well, do not let them take you into a high, because if you do, then the other side of the pendulum will happen, and you will have to go into a deep low. And this is what happens with people who take drugs. They take heroin, cocaine, whatever it is, in order to get a high. And if you go there, you go for the high, you will have to have the low. And so what you need to be able to do is two things. One is you need to have a very great capacity to handle the lows if you want to go for the highs. And so your range of management of feelings must be large, Like you remember when we got my piano, I wanted 88 keys, all the way from the lowest of the low notes to the highest of the high notes. And mostly what people have is a little keyboard of 30 or 40 keys or something, not too high, not too low, just somewhere in the middle. Okay, but some people, they want the whole range. But you have to be strong to manage that big range. And if you want to be strong, then you must accumulate these powers. The power to endure, especially endurance and perseverance. Use all these things that happen to increase your endurance and perseverance, and then you increase your range of what's manageable. The other thing to do is to pull back from enjoying the highs and be more neutral about the highs, because if you're pretty neutral about the highs, then you can be pretty neutral about the lows. So the reason why we have this practice in BK to say that all our successes are actually not So my success is Baba's success. So you give all your highs to Baba, and then he will take away all your lows. And this is a yukti. And he gives us all the yuktis, but we don't take it as yuktis. We take it as fact. And that means we haven't understood the difference between a fact and a yukti. Because nobody tells you that there is a difference, but I'm telling you there is. And use it. You know, we're supposed to figure it out, but that takes time. So in order to shorten the amount of time it takes to figure things out, we can just spell it out and say, you know, this is there are spiritual laws, and we have to understand how they work, and then you can use them to your advantage instead of getting, as you mentioned, you know, overwhelmed by your pain, by your difficulties, and so on. It's just because I think we have not been adequately informed about the laws of spirituality, and so we need to do that. I mean, I feel so fortunate that with Daddy Janki all the time, you know, sticking needles into me and, and telling me this and that and the other, I really got a lot of information which you hardly ever hear these days. So I'm trying to make it available as much as possible, because it's really necessary for us to know these things, so we don't have to go through all these you know, heartaches and difficulties and so on.
Okay, thanks, Denise Ben. That's been a really beautiful hour and 20 minutes. Could we invite you to do a meditation commentary for the next few minutes until 7 o'clock? I see there's no more questions on the chat.
Om Shanti. To go deep into yourself. Understand that there is a wound. Your wound is still bleeding. It's badly bruised. You put many bandages over it. You looked the other way and hoped it would heal itself. But it didn't. In your subconscious, it throws weak thoughts into your mind. Like a child who has been shamed and rejected, sometimes gets very depressed, sometimes very aggressive because of the wound. Now go down there and open up those bandages carefully, gently. Let those bandages fall away and see the extent of the damage, the wound, with pus, bruising, hurting. Now, bring the power of yoga gentle energy of healing light. Shine it on that wound. Let the vibration of Baba's energy touch your wound. The disinfectant hurts. You react in pain, but yet you know the pus must be cleaned. The infection must be addressed. Put that alcohol little at a time on the wound. Even though the pain erupts, open yourself up and allow it to pass through and pass away. Little by little, the damage is getting removed. Hurt is getting reduced. Patiently, again and again, visit your wound with love, compassion, healing, learning about yourself, about your wound. Know that it will get healed. This is Baba's guarantee. Shanti. Om Shanti.
Om Shanti. Thank you. That was very special. I don't think I've ever heard a meditation commentary on wound healing before. Thanks so much for the last hour and a half. It was very insightful, and I think what I appreciate about you and many other Brahmins as well appreciate about you is that you touch on subjects that others do not touch on. And very few people understand pain, how to manage pain, and how to overcome pain using Baba's Murli. And that is very special. Thank you for sharing your 45 years experience in dealing with this very sensitive subject. I'm sure those listening to you today have learned something very deep and special. I think the best message for me is that not to give up on oneself and not to have unrealistic expectations from oneself and from life. Very deep message indeed. Thank you. Many blessings, Denise Ben, on behalf of the South African family and whoever else in the global family is watching you right now. Many blessings and thank you.
Very much appreciated. And in terms of really removing that pain, the wound, working and healing the self, you made it so powerful. And how to work through the process of creating a good relationship with pain. And for me, that is so incredible. Thank you. It's a real gift for myself, I would say. but also share this lovely gift with others as well, and not fighting the pain and not suppressing the pain, but really embracing that pain, to know that the pain is there and it's holding me back. It's not allowing me to be my real natural self. It's not allowing me to take fully from Baba and to enjoy this confluence age beautifully. So thank you for this special gift, my lovely sister. Many, many blessings. And
goodbye to everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. I think it's evening for you, morning for me. And best wishes to all South Africa and beyond. And Om Shanti.